Well, let me ask you a different question then. What is your perspective on how difficult the issue of scale is? I mean, you take a company like yours, it's got the great name out there, a lot of excitement, a lot of buzz. Are you going to be facing a whole new slew of problems here in the next year as you expand in Northern California?
Yes. It's it's been a very interesting experience going through the startup phase, kind of the very creative, very high energy, let's just do it and we'll figure out the details later kind of outlook, to developing into a car company that is producing cars, putting cars on the road, servicing vehicles, dealing with real-world challenges, customers that have questions, dealing with the customers adapting to the new technology, and scaling the company to be able to do that. Putting in much more energy into budgets and scaling back the amount of money we're spending to accomplish the same amount of tasks to reach profitability. But it's very interesting and exciting. We're the only electric car company now in production of highway-capable vehicles. We have well over 1,000 cars on the road right now, over 4 million customer miles driven, and it's very exciting.
Yeah, I heard they've already started the Tesla road clubs where they all get together and meet and compare notes. Are you at the point yet where your major concern is less technology and more figuring out the commercialization of your product?
It's a very good question and a good point. Absolutely. Our everything in the Roadster and in Model S, from the power electronics to the motor to the battery pack, are all Tesla Motors' intellectual property at this point, and really it's commercialization first of the Roadster, which is of course our test case that has been quite successful, and in approximately in under 2 years putting Model S on the road. And absolutely our main focus right now is exactly that.
Go ahead, Mayor.
One of the things that I want to follow on to that is I think that we need to really think about is he can be as successful as he wants in commercialization, but if the infrastructure is not in place to deal with all these vehicles, and it's not just Tesla. You heard the previous panel talk about BYD, Coda, CT&T. There's an alphabet soup of all these companies out there that are, and also the large auto manufacturers, the existing ones, are all going to move into this area. I drive an electric vehicle, all electric. I have for almost 9 years now, and I love it. It's an absolutely great little RAV4. It's been a great vehicle. But the problem is that, everybody talks about, well, we ought to put charging stations on parking meters and put them here and here and here. The system simply would not tolerate at this point today that kind of abuse, both on the distribution system as well as the supply of electricity. So there are a lot of systems that need to be created to be able to deal with what I think is the future, which is going to be decentralized electric transportation. So we need you need education, you need time use pricing, you need prohibitions of charging at certain times, at least in the beginning, and because you plug one of these puppies in with a fast charger, and it's like putting a whole house on the system. And think about having, when you have 1,000 of them out there, it's manageable. When you have 1 million of them out there, it's a different story. And I don't think the time is too far off when you will have substantial numbers of these things.
Give us a couple of years. We're working on it.
No. I just think the problem is someone, and thank God there are, I think the ISO is doing a decent job of this, utilities are looking at it, and others. A lot of the private sector is looking at making sure we have the infrastructure to withstand what we all hope is coming from whatever particular company. And that's something we have to pay attention to, because the system could fail, not for any fault of his, or not for any fault of any of the companies, but it simply won't be usable if we don't do this right.
You make some very good points. One, some of the data that we've been fortunate and able to collect, having so many cars on the road right now, and is that our customer base is charging their cars exactly the way the utility companies want them to be charging. Most of our owners, I think it's like 85% of the charging of Roadsters is overnight, so off-peak, which is hugely benefits the utilities from both a grid perspective and a financial perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I have a time use meter on mine at home, and it makes a difference. You plug that in on peak, you're going to pay substantially for it. And yet, to give an example, on the policy side, you've got consumer groups opposing time use metering because they figure that people at the low end of the economic spectrum are not going to get any benefit from it, going to get hit the hardest, whatever the reasoning is. But you really have to have not only education, you've got to have an economic penalty if somebody plugs one of these on peak, because the costs are substantial, real costs of the system.
But if you can provide low-cost storage at the point of use,
yeah,
you've solved that.
Yeah, you solve a lot of the problem, not all of it, because you still have the distribution system, your capacitors and transformers, those things can't take the load right now if you did it.
Mayor, let me ask you, I came across a quote here, and I'll just ask you to comment on it because it goes directly to your point. It said that this year that clean cars will form part of a broader shift to smart mobility. Smart mobility will quickly permeate beyond simply the transport sector and will be integrated into the new energy paradigm and influence the design of urban systems, even shipping ports. What do you think of that comment?
Even shipping ports? Even shipping ports. I thought it was just a port, but all right. Long Beach, along with Los Angeles, you heard previous speakers talk about, 43 or 45% of all the goods that come in the United States come through those ports, and they're both almost about the same size. It will do that. I have pushed my port to be able to start looking at advanced technologies for transportation. Just to give you one example, there's about a 4.5-mile run from the port now to the intermodal yards. So you've got an 8 or 9 mile loop if you did it. Right now, you probably have, conservatively doing those runs, 4,000 to 5,000 trucks on any given day making that run. If you designed a system from a blank sheet of paper, you'd never have 4,000 or 5,000 moving parts moving those boxes. And what we've gone out with an RFQ on is an advanced system, which, just think of it as just a giant conveyor belt that does a 9-mile loop. It can be rail, it can be maglev, it can be skyhooks for all we care, it doesn't really matter. But some new system that would probably be electric driven that would get rid of what is a very antiquated and very inefficient way to move goods today. So you're already starting to see that move into that sector, and I think you'll see a lot more of it. Environmental requirements are not yet pushing it yet, but they will. But to me, I've done this because I just see gross inefficiencies in an area in the port that has limited space, where it's much more important to have boxes stored there than it is to have trucks coming in and out at that frequency level. And there's about 10,000 trucks, they call them frequent flyers, on any given day that come in and out of that port. And so you're already seeing that shift to a smart mobility system. It's not here yet, but it's not that far off either.
Michael, let me ask you about, everybody hears about the importance of reducing our carbon, and yet a lot of people, I think, are pretty skeptical about climate legislation, climate treaties, whether it's going to have any impact, even if they're enacted, what's it going to do? How important do you think carbon measurement and carbon management is?
Well, I think there's two perspectives on it. I mean, I think the first perspective is, and I think the solar PV market has seen this, if the market is being driven by externalities that are artificial, German subsidies, Spain subsidies, now Ontario, feed-in tariffs, you're subject to the whims of policy. as opposed to technology or business decisions. So the first would be if you could ideally drive towards a system that's going to have payback that's not dependent on that. You get the secondary benefit of CO2 emission reductions without having to worry about a policy that's creating an artificial demand for the value of a CO2 emission. So I think that's probably the most important part. The other part, though, is it is potentially a really important issue. Nobody knows the answers to whether or not this is man-made or nature-made in terms of global warming or climate change. And in my perspective, the cost of assigning a cost of CO2 emissions could potentially be a very low-cost solution towards what could be a very expensive experiment if, in fact, CO2, particularly man-made CO2, has such an adverse effect. So on one hand, it's necessary. On the other hand, it's really technology's job to create solutions that are business economical as opposed to policy economical.